The title of this incident is Reverend Stan. This is Jack Lynch. This is being recorded July 31st, 2020. This particular occurrence happened about June of 1989. It was in Portland, Oregon at Priestley Oil and Chemical, just down the hill from Emmanuel Hospital, that part of the city. Priestley Oil and Chemical dealt with both packaged lubricants, solvents, and chemicals, and also the same things in tanks delivered by tanker trucks. There was a warehouse where we stored the containerized goods, and outside was some pump areas for filling trucks for the tank material. Drivers that didn't have anything else to do would go into the warehouse and help out until their loads were called for. There were a couple people that were full-timers in the warehouse. I was the warehouse manager and had a couple other guys that worked with me to get things made. But you could always count on a few drivers around to lend a hand and have something funny to talk about. There was an opening for a driver, a gentleman named Stan. Evidently fit the bill. They hired him. He wasn't tall, he wasn't particularly big. He was about 5'8", normal weight, mildly curly dark hair, and white-faced, clean-shaved. He was early into his middle age. He didn't really strike a person as pleasant. He'd smile, he'd say the same things other people did, but you knew that he wasn't really genuine about it. We found out that he had just graduated from divinity school. He was going to be a minister. While he was at work at Priestley Oil and Chemical, he showed himself as different than the rest. He wanted everyone to know that he was better than you were, that he knew right from wrong and no one else did. But he didn't really wax poetically about it. It was just occasional sarcasm. Stan was, as far as being trained to do things, he's the kind of guy that you might have a 3-month training program, and most people work their way through it and learn all the way through all the stages and then go to work. Stan, as far as they could train him, was about the first 2 weeks, and then after that, it just didn't go in his head. It just didn't go anywhere, and he wasn't very happy to learn anything new like that. I guess he thought he wasn't going to be there very long. He was licensed and given a package truck to get loaded with box goods and drum goods and bucket goods, which meant that he had to pull up to the back side of our dock at the warehouse and load up. Some people would help him a little bit, but that was only to get him out of their hair as quickly as possible. And those same people, if they had their druthers, they would get to that dock first so that he would stand out there and wait. He wouldn't help them. He'd stand and wait, they'd get their trucks loaded, and then they'd get out and avoid Stan. Stan was a genuinely smiley-faced, nasty clown. We had a locker room in a loft inside the warehouse. All the guys that worked in the warehouse or with trucks all wore uniforms. These were basically things that you could get dirty. At the end of the day, you'd put them in the dirty bin, and a laundry service would come in and pick them up once a week and give you fresh clothes to wear out of the street. That was the one thing that all the drivers and warehouse people all had in common. We'd basically all get together and meet up there in the morning before work started, and a little bit in the afternoon when work was done. You'd have a word, you'd have a story, something like that. Stan was always off farther away from the crew. Everyone was glad that he wasn't in close. This was an interesting situation. The laundry service had one little extra thing they did for us. In our spare locker that was empty, on the top shelf was a stack of dirty magazines. These weren't your Playboys. There might have been one Playboy in the stack. It was 6 or 8 inches thick, that stack. These were your dirty fuck books. These are the pornography that was pornographer's pornography. I always figured you'd seen one of them, you'd probably seen them all. But every now and then someone would see something in one that was just funnier than all get out, and they'd have to show everybody. That was pretty cool. The service that uniform company provided, that one driver, was when he came in, I think it was on Wednesdays, he would take the top 3 or 4 inches of that stack and remove them. They would go back with the dirty clothes. When he came up with the clean clothes, he had another stack of dirty magazines that he'd place on top of the pile. So with 100, 150 stops that he'd make during the week, there were other shops that had the same situation going. There was always a variety, a change in dirty magazine. And they weren't brand new. Occasionally there'd be some, but among about 150 shops, everybody got a different look at different things. When I found out about that, I sort of laughed. I thought, well, that's kind of nice. Stan didn't like that. I guess that really irked him. That was sinful. It was bad. And it was something that he could put a stop to and make all the other guys understand that he's in charge. Something like that. Early one week, a guy went upstairs early to get changed out. He's going to go home early. I guess he's going to start early the next day. He came down those stairs and said, "Hey, Mark." Mark was the mechanic. He's a young guy. Nosy, too. "Mark, where's those books?" Mark says, "What books?" The guy says, "You know, the fuck magazines." "Where are they?" Mark says, "They're up there." The guy says, "No, they're not." Both of them went up, looked in the locker. Nothing there. Well, where could they be? "Mark, you ought to know. You've been here all day." "I haven't seen them. Haven't seen anything." More guys kind of shuffled in later on to change out to go home, and they were all asked. Everybody was wondering. We looked all around the warehouse, around the perimeter, and wasn't anything to be found. The next day when we came in, Mark had a report for us. He says, "I found them." Where were they? They were in the dumpster. Someone had put them in the dumpster and put some old boxes over top so you wouldn't see them. Well, of course, leave it to Mark. He'll sniff it out. He'll find it. And they were placed back in that locker up on the top shelf. Everyone thought that was the end of that, but we were still curious as to who did it or why they did it. Maybe it was a prank gone bad. Who knows? A few more days go by, and Mark comes in. He wasn't the first one in the morning. The first guy in was Stan. He decided he was going to get his route started early and not have to stay late. So he was in first thing, and Mark was right behind him. Stan went upstairs. Mark was downstairs checking his gear. A few other guys came in later, half hour, 40 minutes later, and went to Mark and says, "Who put all those magazines in our toilet?" Mark says, "What are you talking about?" "Those fuck magazines in our locker. The whole pile of them is sitting in our toilet getting wet." Mark says, "Well, pull them out." "We already did." "But who did that?" Well, Mark knew all of a sudden. Mark was the last one out the night before, and he was the second one in this morning. Guy in front of him was Stan. So a couple of those guys that were asking Mark, and Mark caught Stan before he could leave. They confronted him. This was a confrontation where you measured the distance in inches from face to face. "Did you put those fuck books in the toilet, Stan?" "Well, yeah, I did." "Those aren't your books. They're not yours to do that with. They're not yours." "Well, you guys don't have any business with that kind of thing here. You don't have any business looking at that sort of thing. That stuff is awful. That stuff is dirty. That stuff's sinful." And he did a little 30-second sermon on them. And they weren't having any of that. And they said, "You don't touch those. We're going to get them cleaned up. We're going to get it taken care of, put in the locker. We're not going to lock these things up from you. If they turn up damaged or thrown away, we're going to come for you." Stan's shoulders shimmied a little bit. He got spooked. Stan went back downstairs, got in his truck, and made his runs. A couple days went by. Stan called in. He was having trouble with his truck. He said that each time he stopped and he had to start it again, that it took longer to start. It was getting worse and worse real quick. The office told him, "Get that truck straight in here. Don't turn it off for anything. Just get it back in here. We'll have Mark look at it." Stan brought his truck back, backed it up to the dock. He went into the office. Instead of being like another driver that would back their truck up to the dock to get it repaired or looked at and stick around to give answers to the mechanic and also help out in the warehouse while your truck is inoperable, like all other drivers did, he's up in the office drinking coffee and BSing with the office staff, hiding out in the bathroom downstairs, taking a walk out on the front sidewalk, just staying out of sight so he doesn't have to do anything. As I'd said before, Mark the mechanic, Mark Frangipani, was the most curious guy you'd ever see. He would not be happy unless or until he knew what was in your lunch bag, what sandwich you had, what kind of bread, what the meat was. See it himself. If you got picked up from work, he wanted to see who was picking you up. There was no getting away from Mark and what he knew. And if you wanted to know something, just like the other guys knew, you asked Mark. He probably dug into it and figured it out one way or the other. Well, this curious Mark lifts the hood on Stan's truck, looks it over, and goes and gets in the cab to start it up. Looks around, finds Stan's lunch bucket and opens it up. Inside his lunch bucket, he found a dirty fuck book. It wasn't one from the dirty stack up in the locker room. This was brand new. Had the cellophane on it. Had the sales sticker on it. This is one of those $10.95 ones, the cream of the crop. Mark went and got me. Jack, come here. Take a look at this. He wasn't even whispering. It was like a stage whisper, but it was loud. You could hear it. I got with him and he says, "Look in there." I says, "What?" He says, "Look in the lunch bucket." I climb in, lunch bucket's open, and there's that dirty magazine right there in Stan's lunch bucket. I said, "Where was this all?" "Oh, it was behind the seat." "Oh, you mean the seat was all the way back and so you couldn't find it?" "Oh, I found it." Yeah, he did. Right away, just to make sure, there's 3 drivers in the warehouse helping out while they're waiting for their loads to be accumulated. I went and got those 3 guys. Mark took them on the tour of Stan's truck. Up they climbed, they saw the book, and they looked at both sides. They didn't open up, they didn't break the wrapper or anything like that. It's just brand new sitting right there. Pretty quick, one of them got on his own truck's radio and called the other drivers on the radio, and the office heard it too. Stan was up in the office talking, and you could hear the company radio. Mark was saying, any of you guys want to come back early, get done quick, because Stan's going to be leaving here, and he's taking his lunch bucket with him. Someone said, so what? What about lunch bucket? Well, that's where his magazine is. Nobody asked any more questions. They knew what that magazine was without any further discussion. Stan left that office on the run, down to his truck, found his lunch bucket open, found that dirty magazine, and that's not my magazine. Somebody put it there. And I said, no, they didn't. I was here when Mark opened that thing up, and there it was. The other drivers are hee-hawing and laughing. Stan didn't even turn red, but he had this deer in the headlight look. He'd been caught big time. A few days go by, and all of a sudden Stan makes an announcement to everybody that he's going to be leaving in 2 weeks. A church is going to install him as their minister. A church in Lake Oswego. Looking back on it, I don't know, maybe that was an excuse for him to leave. I mentioned when he said that, well, if you're being installed, what, in 2 weeks? He said, yes. I said, maybe a bunch of us should come down so we could enjoy it. No, you're not invited. You mean we can't go in that church? And I said, what I understand is all churches are open to everybody at all times, no matter how sinful they are. That's where you go, isn't it? Well, you don't need to be there. Well, maybe we will. He got the concerned look, and he sweated it. 2 weeks went by, and wherever Stan ended up, who knows? None of us went down to that church that he mentioned to check it out. Hindsight, we should have looked. It probably would have made a third investment in the story. That's the story of Reverend Stan and his dirty little mind.